Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you're attending from. I want to welcome you today to Generative AI, the use of language models like ChatGPT in a learning environment. This is our Teaching with Technology Brown Bag series hosted by the CIO and the ETI. Our presenters today are Dr. Clifton Dalgard, Dr. Joshua Duncan, Dr. Elizabeth Steinbach, Dr. Vincent Capaldi, Dr. Greg Booth, Mr. Sean Baker, and myself here to take you on this journey. These are our goals for today. So I am now happy to turn it over to our first set of speakers.
All right, thank you, everybody. We wanted to introduce this topic just by talking about some background terminology, maybe help disambiguate some of the terms you may have heard in some of the AI literature and publications recently. So big data, it's really this concept of processing or storing vast amounts of information. We often think about it in terms of the V's, so volume, how much data there is. Nowadays on the internet, there's just volumes and volumes of data being created every single day, and it's hard to deal with all that. Velocity is the speed with which the data is coming to you. So lots of our data comes in streams and updates and push notifications, et cetera. And finally, variety. There are different types of data. So more traditionally, you probably have read studies that talk about, for example, patient risk factors and patient outcomes. That's nice structured data typically, something that's easy to fit in an Excel spreadsheet, for example. However, a lot of the more nuanced data that is more powerful is the unstructured data, things like images and written and spoken language and video and things like that. And big data is really the grab bag term for all of the techniques used to either store or process that kind of complex set of data. Artificial intelligence is really a field that's very broad that focuses a little bit more on the computer systems necessary to do a lot of big data things. And typically those computer systems are designed to approximate human performance for a particular task. So artificial intelligence is a little bit more task oriented than kind of the larger concept of big data. Machine learning is really the nuts and bolts algorithms that are used to achieve a lot of the artificial intelligence goals. So you may hear about things like neural networks or random forests or a variety of other algorithms. And the way I like to think about machine learning is it's really the vehicle that you drive to get to the destination of artificial intelligence. So you may have heard the terms artificial neural network and deep learning. The artificial neural network history goes back all the way to the 1940s. A neurophysiologist and mathematician kind of contrived that you can organize a system of math equations much similar to how a neural network in your brain is attached. And by having kind of repeat exposures, that neural network can update itself and kind of learn essentially. And the neural networks, they kind of waxed and waned in popularity over the decades following that initial conception. But with increased compute power and more availability for high computing engines, it's become more and more available and more widely used over the last 20 or so years. And deep learning really refers to kind of colloquially, when we hear deep learning, it's talking about neural networks. It's just kind of a fancier type of neural network. It's not just a simple input output. It's generally an input with several kind of complicated layers in between and then an output. And that's really where ChatGPT starts to come into the picture here. It's a example of a deep learning application. And finally, natural language processing. Although you can use a variety of techniques to do natural language processing, which is really dealing with written or spoken language to extract meaning, oftentimes deep learning is used to do that. And again, ChatGPT is a perfect example. So as a brief kind of visual of some of the things we just talked about, artificial intelligence kind of sits at the intersection of big data, computer science, and statistics. And if you kind of expand artificial intelligence and the image on the right, within that lives machine learning. Again, that's the algorithms, the nuts and bolts of how you do a lot of AI. Within that, you also have things like, as we mentioned, natural language processing, NLP, computer vision, where you're using systems to understand an image or a video. And then finally, deep learning is that subset of machine learning where you've got kind of complicated neural networks. I'll hand it off here to Colonel Capaldi.
So I just wanted to put a plug in here for our Foundations in Artificial Intelligence and Machine Learning course that we're about to pilot at the end of this month. You know, when Dean Elster came on board this past year, he charged the Subcommittee for Innovation to look into creating course content to create a foundation for not only our learners, but our teachers, our educators, to be able to harness some of these new technologies that are coming on board and coming to life in medicine. So right now we're piloting in the course starting at the end of this month, and then going on, we're going to refine it and actually have various iterations of this course that are targeted not only to the foundational aspects of AI and machine learning, but if people wanted to go further and deeper into this material and learn how to do it themselves, this is a great opportunity that we're really pushing forward to here at USU. So I wanted to just put that plug in and then turn it over to Dr. Dahlgren.
So we're going to get a little more into ChatGPT specifically, and it is sometimes said that a technology is mature when the general public is inquiring about its use. And we've all been noting the frequent news reports, and we have a large attendance today. It's clear that ChatGPT, a specific generative AI tool, is reaching that threshold. So ChatGPT is really building upon the advancements in AI with the continued development of what is called large-scale language models, or LLMs. Language models have been an idea in AI since the field was first established in the 1940s, yet the detailed elements of language models are not really part of common public knowledge. So a question you may be asking is, what is a language model? Well, a language model is just a statistical model used to predict words or the sequence of words. And language models are useful for a variety of problems found in linguistics. You are familiar with these applications in linguistics with everyday use for speech recognition on your phone, handwriting recognition, natural language processing, and even scanning documents for optical character recognition. A really simple way to think of a language model is that the model takes in data in the form of text, or in today's technology, large amounts of text, and has the ability to perform skills, which are called parameters, to generate some useful output from that text. And the generative AI tools we're interested in today may be built from large-scale language models that are trained on petabytes or greater amount of text data from a variety of different sources. And they have billions of parameters, hence skills, to generate a wide range of useful output relevant for our everyday tasks. So here I'm going to show a simple example of a single parameter language model that would be a model that has a skill to identify animals from a text input. So if we input the text sentence, the quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog, the skill may output, there is a fox and a dog within the sentence. Now ChatGPT builds greatly upon this simple example, and ChatGPT has approximately 175 billion skills or parameters, and it was trained upon 570 billion gigabytes of text data, all constructed to interact with a user, an everyday user, in a conversational manner. And now we're going to show some examples of it in use.
So ChatGPT, being one of these large language models, has gotten a lot of media attention, and many of you may be wondering, how could we use this in medical school? How can we as faculty and students use this? Some ideas are here to include creating course content, helping with manuscript and question generation, personalizing feedback, and translation. So let's do a live demo and take a look at some of these use cases. So this is ChatGPT. I have a few prompts that I'm going to paste in here. This first one, I teach at a medical school, and I want to create a lesson plan for responsible use of large language models in education. I put that in, and this is the output that I get. Have lesson objectives, breakdown to include time, what each of those would look like, materials that I need, and how to do assessment as well. That is pretty impressive. I think many of you can imagine how that could be helpful, especially as we're generating new content in our courses. Here's another one. Let's say we're a student or working on a manuscript. create a 800-word essay about the following thesis about the use of large language models in medical education healthcare. And that's exactly what it does. So it creates an essay. I think that can be a good starting point. We'll talk about some of the limitations of using large language models, the outputs, how to cite that. One thing that can happen, especially if you're asking it to write a lot, is that it can stop. You can just ask it to continue and it will. But I'll stop that prompt there just so we can demo a couple of other prompts. Let's say we're introducing new content or changing some of our session objectives in a course, and then we want to come up with some board style exam questions. So I teach neuroscience at a medical school, create a board style exam question to test the following lesson objective. So generate something that looks a lot like an NBME style question and gives an answer explanation. So you can imagine how this could be used. Obviously, we wouldn't want to do this without any kind of expert supervision, but it can be a great starting point because it can take hours to generate even single exam questions. And then something that I am particularly excited about is personalizing feedback. So let's take a fourth-year medical student's note, for example. If we want to provide narrative feedback on their note, or if I'm a student and want to get some feedback, say I type in my HPI and I just ask for some narrative feedback on that HPI. And we get some substantive feedback. So has some interpretations. Since this is trained on 45 terabytes of data, has that 175 billion parameters. ChatGPT has already passed the boards. So it is an expert, has memorized all of those things. So while not everything is 100% factual, you have to take that with a grain of salt. It can be a great starting point, especially when we have things like writer's block or need some assistance. Another use case is translation. So you can imagine how this could be useful, especially as we're doing global health engagement, but language translation can come in many forms. So I'll turn it back over to Dr. Dalgaard to talk more about that.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm just going to briefly provide just a few more examples of ChatGPT's usefulness for research productivity. And one exciting aspect, as was just mentioned, is that ChatGPT may be considered language agnostic. It can translate from one human language to another. And while most of its uses will be associated with human language, its use in computer science and programming, as programming languages are often based on text, is rapidly exploding. So here's an example in which I have existing code in one programming language, Python, and it may need to have the original code be used in a new software environment or by another user that requires a different programming language, in this example, R. And I can use ChatGPT to translate one code into another code without requiring the need of a human programmer or his or her expertise or knowledge. So as you can see here on the left, the code dependencies, syntax, function, etc. of the original programming code is distinct and different from the new desired code. But ChatGPT can facilitate accurately and highly efficient translation for the desired task. So often when we talk about the use of generative AI tools, we are often concerned with accuracy, i.e., what are the underlying facts that it's outputting. The nice thing about using this in programming languages is, and in this example, since we had generated the original code and we have data, we can input this data in both the original code and the translated code and test this output. And in this case, as you can see in the left and the right, the output from the Python code and the R code match exactly and gives us confidence that ChatGPT performs its function robustly. So ChatGPT's use is even more robust as it can generate code new from the beginning. And here's an example in which I had the task to make a data structure to organize and process new data. And this is a very common task in analysis and programming. And ChatGPT has certainly been trained about components of this task before from existing textbooks, the internet, etc. Here, I can just have a dialog prompt make Python code for generating a grid of cells as a geodata frame, which is a common data structure. And ChatGPT will provide a well-commented code base for that request in seconds, which I could review and make easy modifications to be exact for my desired income. And there are nearly infinite amount of use cases for generative AI in programming, and we all likely will benefit for its wide use in a range of academic disciplines.
As we engage on all of this, it's obvious from the preceding slides the power which LLMs have for transforming everyday life in academia, research, computer science, and elsewhere. But we are also in the early days of this technology being available, and we need to be careful about the way that we engage with that. Specifically, whether you're acting privately or in your official capacity for the university, anything you ever enter into a public LLM, as in a ChatGPT or something which is off the street and not paid for and provided by your home organization, you need to make sure that it's information that you could otherwise release on the public internet, because in putting it into any of these LLMs, that is functionally what you are doing. You're providing it to an outside entity who can inspect the information you've provided. So don't provide personal data or information. Definitely don't go posting cooey out there and asking for an interpretation of what it means. Don't put your hiring or your performance management issues out there. It's one thing if you go and, like so many others, go and ask for suggestions about how to write a PD, but don't ask it for a pip on Sean Baker's performance, because that is putting personal information out there, and that's a problem for all of us. Very related, don't ask it to write your contracts for you. You can ask for clarifications, that sort of thing, but when we start putting very specific vendors out there, things get complicated legally for all of us. There are private models which are coming out there. We've talked a lot today about ChatGPT and the work which Microsoft has been doing with OpenAI, and they are working to provide commercial implementations of the ChatGPT, which are unique to an organization, where your data will never leave. Anything that you subtrain the LLM on will remain private to you. That is something which we should, as an organization, be looking at and engaging with, not necessarily that vendor, but an LLM generally, as we go through competitive solicitation. And as we do that, we also need to appreciate that when we subtrain these models, they are generalists to begin with. They can do programming, they can do medicine, they can pass the bar as well. But we need to make sure that as we subtrain them, that we are subtraining them with material for which we have appropriate license. That's something which we're going to have to get far more people involved in when we do this. And then the last note, won't surprise anybody if you've done this long enough, is that we should be anticipating that there will be some larger DoD guidance coming on the use of LLMs, probably very consistent with this portion of the presentation. I have no inside information. I just want everyone to be ready for that guidance when it does come.
So this is a list of how students might use ChatGPT or other programs similar to this. But really what you're trying to do is think about why your students will need it, what they could do with it, how they could use it, because this is going to impact the type of assessment features that you're going to be thinking about. And it's going to probably impact a little bit some of their independent thinking and support maybe more creative impacts and true learning. So you want to really be thinking about how your students might use it with or without permission. You need to be thinking about these ideas now as you're developing your content and your curriculum. So there's some real important learning challenges that can occur with these that you need to consider. And you want to be prepared for addressing these both in your syllabus with student questions. This list is not an exhaustive list, but you really want to think about exactly how a student could use it so you can deal with these learning challenges and turn them into learning opportunities, where your students are going to increase active learning and increase critical thinking and have these types of tools purposefully integrated and not just something that they turn to get an assignment done quickly. So really keep in mind when you may want to approve use of it, how you want it actually integrated within the curricular aspects of your content, and what you're trying to do and why with these tools, or else your students are going to go ahead and use them, and you're going to have to spend a lot more time thinking about what exactly you need to do in order to prepare for this. So, of course, in order to plan for this, you need to be considering both your classroom policy, your department policy, the university policy. You know, we've already seen that some school boards have banned ChatGPT. New York City and Seattle schools have outright banned it completely on their networks. They're not going to be able to have them and use them at this time because people are reacting to it. They're not thinking proactively. You know, some cases, there's a nice example here of when somebody may not want a student to use it and what that language could look like in the syllabus. And then examples of when they expect them to use it and a short snippet from the syllabus on that.
So while you're thinking about how your students might use this, you might also be thinking about how you would be using it in your own scholarly writing. And I'm going to highlight a study that was done out of Northwestern University that kind of summarizes where publishing and scholarly writing is on large language models. What these researchers did was they took 50 medical abstracts from prestigious journals like the New England Journal of Medicine, JAMA publications, BMJ reports, and they asked ChatGPT to replicate them. And then they ran them through a plagiarism checker, an AI output detector, and then they had humans in the field actually look at it. The plagiarism checker didn't find any of them. So plagiarism checkers are not compatible right now with finding AI created content. The AI output detector only found 66% of these, and humans didn't do a lot better. They did 68%. So what does that mean for publications in general and publishing houses? Well, they're trying to figure out their policies. Most publishers right now are leaning towards not allowing AI as an author. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And they're discussing how AI should be cited and should be used. And as a result, some of the bigger style guides like AMA Style Guide and APA are starting to come up with preliminary policies on how you can cite AI if you're using it in your writing. And then, of course, right now, I think the best policy is transparency of use. If you're using it, just be transparent where you used it and how you used it. And then JAMA's official, so if you're looking for what the guidelines are for publishers, they're going to vary. Look for author instructions. And JAMA's guidelines to author is that AI cannot be cited as an author, but it can be used in your writing. And to do that, you need to put it either in the acknowledgement section and say what part was written by AI, or put it in your methods section. I have a feeling that's probably going to change. All of this is these are preliminary policies. So I imagine as more people understand how this tool is being used in writing and assisting people in their scientific communications, you'll start to see some of these policies change too. And then APA put out, this is just an example for you all to look at if you're using it in your writing, in text citation for retrievable chat, that's how you cite it. And if it's not retrievable, then there's a second citation there.
All right, as we look toward assessment, this could have some profound effects on how we manage our courses. So before we restrict the use of large language models, here's something I would challenge you to think about is what are your objectives? What are those module objectives, course objectives, individual session objectives, and what competency are we trying to produce in our students, and what competency are we trying to assess? And is it still worth doing, if we're having students write essays, is it still worth doing it that way? Looking forward, text is going to become free. So I think of this, we used to do statistical analysis by hand. I think many of us have gone through that exercise, but now we use statistical software where we're doing machine learning algorithms that are just infeasible to do by hand. We are very quickly, as we've hit this inflection point, we're getting to where we have text generation that is produced automatically. This is going to change the way we provide healthcare. You can imagine having an actual conversation with a provider during your appointment rather than them typing a note. So Large language models would have the capability of summarizing a conversation and turning that into a note. So really, I want you to think about generating that competency in our students. If we allow large language models to do some of that text generation by hand, we can then focus on higher order tasks, developing critical thinking, and then having dialogue about those conversations. So how can we supervise AI and how can we use it effectively to produce the product that we want? And turn it over to Dina to talk a little bit more about some of the cases where we do want to be able to detect when something is generated by a large language model.
So how are you going to recognize this? What are you going to do about it? One of the big things that I have been telling faculty is to get to know your student's voice, their writing voice. What does it sound like? How do they write? What do you see in their writing? Get to know these students as individuals so that you can see a change in voice. You can see the inconsistency in the writing, that lack of emotion, that uniqueness that you know the student normally does. You're going to want to really try and pay attention to your learners and their voice. That's going to be one of the key things, especially in writing, that is going to key you into what's going on and if the student possibly did use ChatGPT or another method. You also want to be sure that students are referencing properly. If you're looking at things and you're seeing information and there aren't the references, you need to talk to your learners about what they've done and how they've done it. There are ChatGPT finders, and as Elizabeth said, some of them are very good and some of them are not. Turnitin will detect plagiarism. It does look at AI input. How good or bad these are right now are really based on the information and data that is out there. So you also have to do your due diligence. I think if I could impress upon one thing for you is that you have to look at it. You can't just throw it into a finder and make that decision. You have to take the time to look at what your students are doing and recognize all the pieces that come together to play for you to see what's going on here. I'm going to turn it over to Cliff to show us an example of the generative AI detector.
So generative AI detectors are somewhat easy to use at this time. They're not really complex. And here's an example of one. This is actually the one that's developed by OpenAI, i.e. those that develop ChatGPT. And normally these are presented as a text box in which you can copy and paste in text, and a submit button. The text that you want to input in cannot be of small size. You cannot input in one sentence and have sufficient amount of information to make a determination. You need to submit a large amount of text from whatever you want to make a determination on in order for the classifier to have an output. And when you submit, this is an example of what it says. The classifier considers the text to be likely AI generated, or if it wasn't, not likely AI generated. And so what you notice here is that this detector is not deterministic. It doesn't say yes or no. It says not likely or likely, thus is probabilistic. And as Elizabeth mentioned, false negatives are often high and false positives are potentially high. And this you may miss, if you use these in isolation, you may misattribute that an individual or student may not be complying with the classroom policies by just using this one alone. So you can use it as criteria to evaluate, but not solely as criteria to evaluate whether or not the assignment was generated through a generative AI tool.
So different ways to address assessment. This has been a big question out on the web and with lots of faculty. I think the first step in thinking about assessment is how are you really attaching deep critical thinking to assignments and tasks provided and sent to your students. So how are you really getting them to do that critical thinking, that deep thinking? Also, you want to think about using project-based learning. Now, project-based learning is not going to take care of all the problems of ChatGPT and these tools, but it will provide some nice guidelines for students and require them to do more active learning for an assignment. Also, your expectations for an assignment are important. And going back to the original questions, why are you asking them a question, or why are you having them do a particular assignment? With this idea of ChatGPT in mind, you want to take a look at that assignment and see, are the expectations realistic and actually showing student learning, helping me see what the students have done and how they've grown and increased their knowledge base. Also consider looking at specific rubric expectations. So developing a rubric for an assignment where there are specific expectations that have specific outputs for the learners, even if they're working individually or on a team, is going to help build out exactly what that assessment is showing. Don't forget to use formative assessment in developing your assessment planning, because that formative assessment is going to tell you where a student is now and allow you to see that product, to see the growth of the student and really help map out what happened. And to add to that, you want students to hand in drafts, because that's going to show you the full continuum of what they've done, where they've been, and where they got to within their learning experience. So these are some of the basic ways to address assessment. Some other basic ways: you want transparency in what's going on, how things are being graded, and how students are actually working within an area. Testing centers are great because you can have people actually proctoring, so you may want to consider testing centers or using that method. Think about reflections and pen and paper class activities. I think we really have lost touch with those in-class pen and paper activities that allow students to kind of work together and compare with one another what they're thinking and doing. So we're at the end of our presentation here, and the future really is now. ChatGPT is free right now. The version we showed you, ChatGPT Plus, does cost money. They're thinking that the next ChatGPT may come out in a year. So you want to think about what's going to happen now versus waiting down the line. People are calling for bigger and better. They want more of this. They want to see more. As Sean said, we're looking at other groups. Both Microsoft and Google are coming out with their own versions of this. So we need to really start thinking about how this is going to impact not only ourselves as faculty, but also our students, our student learning, and how we actually teach. So the future is now, and we greatly appreciate you coming here today to attend this session. Thank you for watching today's Teaching with Technology Brown Bag session. You can view all Teaching with Technology Brown Bags on the USU YouTube channel under the full ETI playlist. Have a nice day.